Dear friends, please welcome our beloved hand of the cause of God, Mr. William Sears and Mrs. Marguerite Sears. Friends, there are so many stories we're waiting to hear about. But I want to say a couple of things before we begin. One is that many of you know Mr. and Mrs. Sears and have seen them at conferences here in Wisconsin and other places around the United States. And since the Sears have traveled all over the world in hundreds and hundreds of places, we've met Baha'is, older believers and new believers and so on, all over the world. I've asked them.
And all the children in the world today here, I met and shook hands with them.
I was hoping that they will tell us some of the stories about some of their travels in other parts of the world other than Wisconsin. I also want to preface this by saying that many of the stories about Mr. Sears and Mrs. Sears and their spiritual journey and their geographical journeys and so on have been recorded in Mr. Sears' books, God Loves Laughter and All Flags Flying and so on. And so I'm hoping that we'll hear some exclusive stuff. Mr. Sears, so many of the wonderful things that I've heard you say at conferences and workshops have had to do with some of the early believers and servants of Baha'u'llah and Abdul-Baha that you've met in your journeys and so on. And once I know that you spent a long time in Haifa over the period of the time between the passing of the Guardian and the election of the Universal House of Justice and many other times. And one of the believers in Haifa, Fujita, was a gardener of Abdul-Baha, and I know you met him.
Yes.
And know some stories about him.
Yes, we do. But just to be obstinate tonight, the first story I'm going to tell is about Wisconsin. Indirectly, though. I brought this heart along, which we had at the convention in Canada and the United States, entry by troops. That's the... Pardon? All right, everybody's the producer, right? That's enough. Let me toss it back here. You see, when I was here 12 years ago approximately, I told one of my favorite teaching stories about this gentleman here. And I said at that time I had a picture of him at home. And that the next time I came, I'd bring it. So I brought it. And I do that because Baha'u'llah says don't make any promises you don't keep. I'm going to tell this story first, so it is really about Wisconsin. It's about the whole world, but it's my favorite teaching story. You can look later. Anyway, his name is Shubharam Mulviya from Uttar Pradesh in India. And if you think that you can arise and conquer the world after all the wonderful things we've heard about the teaching, I brought that story just to tell it to you once more. He lived in a very small town in India, and he heard about the faith, and he was so thrilled when he heard about it. The trouble was he was totally paralyzed. Totally. He lay in his bed and he could move only his hands, you know. But he read and he studied and he loved the faith. And of course he read that everybody had to be a teacher to arise and go out to these places. And his heart was broken. How could he find such a wonderful thing and not be able to arise and do that? The next day, two young men came to see him and they said, Mr. Balbia, we understand that you've been studying and you know a lot about the faith. He said a little. And the two boys said, "Will you teach us the faith?" He said, "Come back in a few days and I'll think about it." They went away and he prayed to Baha'u'llah. And he said, "Well, it was nice. They want me to teach them, but two boys are not the masses of the world, are they?" You know, he took up Mr. Paisley's suggestion to argue with God once in a while. You know, let him know you're there. Anyway, they came back in 3 days and he prayed and had to wept tears about it. But when they came, he says, "All right, I will teach you about the faith. And here's how we're going to do it." He said, "You take the head of my bed and you take the foot of my bed. On the way to the nearby villages, I will teach you. And when we reach the villages, we will all teach the people about the cause of God." And so they started out. And to bring the story to a quick but marvelous conclusion, it was this man, paralyzed, totally paralyzed, who taught these two young men, and together they carried his bed to the villages of India. And those three were the ones responsible for the first all Baha'i villages, the first three all Baha'i villages in India or anywhere in the world paralyzed. So think about your own life when you want to go someplace and remember Shubaram Mulvia. No, none of us had handicaps like that. But he arose and they accomplished something that has never been matched since. Isn't that a wonderful story? Yeah, it is. Wow. It's a beautiful teaching story. We'll never find one better, and that means everybody in this room can do even more than that. Yeah. You want to say something about teaching, or do you want to talk? You mentioned QG.
I don't mind that interruption, by the way.
Oh, good. That's nice.
No, actually, I wanted to say that I've gotten used to that.
Yeah.
Because
not for me, you haven't.
oh, wait till you hear this.
Oh.
That first night that we met in Iceland, I was giving this talk that I was thoroughly unprepared for, relying entirely on the quotations. Except one of my quotations I got off of a tape of a talk that you've given. And I quoted you.
I may be sorry I came here.
And I quoted you in front of, you were in the front row, and I quoted you in front of maybe 300 people there in Iceland.
Yeah.
And you stood up in the middle of my talk and said, "I didn't say that."
This was true.
And then the laughter died down after it seemed like about 30 minutes or so. I had melted about 3 feet by that time. And then you explained that actually you had said it, but the Guardian said it first.
Yes, he said everything first that I said. I burned up. And even when I was called as a result of meeting everybody's grandfather, you know, 2 little children, the boy and the girl, came carrying into the studio where we were recording, running around, and finally I stopped them, and the little girl said, "My grandfather won't let you hurt me." The little boy said, "He's not your grandfather." "He is too my grandfather." I said, "Listen, I weighed about 230 pounds then." And I said, "There's plenty of me to go around, you know. I'm everybody's grandfather." And in the control room, they said later, "Hey, that was real cute. Put it on the record." And I did, and since then I've had letters and phone calls from all over the English-speaking world. "Is that your grandfather?" And so on. So that's how I happen to be everybody's grandfather. Why don't you tell about
You want me to tell about Fujita?
Yes, you're doing very well. She went down in the morning, and someday soon she'll finish a book called Fujita, with all of his wonderful pictures, and some of them by Sam Dadian. Nobody does portraits better than Sam. I mean, Clark is excellent too, but Sam, he is something special. Anyway. Oh, I forgot to say. I used to come down and try to have breakfast with Marguerite and Fujita, and Fujita would tell me to get lost. He was having breakfast with her.
We were the two earliest risers in the Holy Land at that particular time. And so he would tell me stories during breakfast, which made it a very charming time. And he told us about meeting Abdul Baha. I believe it was in Cleveland. He heard about Abdul Baha. He was here from Japan, and he was at the university, and he was also very tiny. I think he was something like 4'11", standing on tiptoe. And so he climbed a telephone pole, and he was standing way up there watching Abdul Baha. And Abdul Baha looked up at him and saw him and motioned to him to come down. And he had him come to him, and from that moment on, Fujita served Abdul Baha for the rest of his life, and subsequently the beloved guardian. He was such a dear man, and he did such beautiful things in the gardens of the Holy Land. He was just wonderful. One of the things that he told was a very, very interesting story, a very dear story. He never married, and Abdul Baha had told him that he would go to Malakut, and there he would meet his bride. And
Heaven.
Pardon?
Heaven.
Yes, in the next world. And Fujita became very ill. I think he had a brain tumor. Anyway, Mr. Sears and Mr. Frazee took him to the hospital and then had to leave. And they came back, or at least he came back in about 6 months. And Fujita was working in the garden, although they had been told he couldn't possibly live 2 days at the very, very outside. And Fujita told him the story when he was in the garden. He said he was in the hospital and in practically a coma. And he saw this wonderful pathway that led to a great light by a doorway, and Abdul Baha standing in the doorway. And he was so thrilled to see the master again. And so he ran as fast as he could down this pathway. And as he approached Abdul Baha, he was sure that this bright light standing alongside of him was Baha'u'llah. But as he approached the doorway, Abdul Baha turned to him and in a very fierce look said, "What are you doing here? It's too soon." And he woke up the next morning, his temperature was gone, he was well, and he was back in the gardens in just a couple of days.
He turned around, he said, and ran as fast as his legs could carry him away from Abdul Baha because he didn't want the master to scold him. My favorite story about Fujita took place in Salt Lake City, probably because that's where I became a Baha'i. But it showed the wisdom and delight and humor of the master. It was covered wagon days, and in Salt Lake City, that's a big celebration. Everybody dresses in Western garb, and they have horses and buggies. And State Street has water running down each curb from the streams in the mountains, all summer long, as in Salt Lake City. And there were about 34 bands in the parade. And the master was way up in the top of State Street. And he had a very important meeting at a hotel down State Street, about 9 blocks. And it was so late, some of the Baha'is, as they do, they were looking at the watch and they could see there was no way for the master to go get to that meeting. And it was with several important people in the city. And so they were trying to think of something to do, not Abdul Baha. He wasn't even paying any attention to the time. And the bands were going down, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He looked at it, and finally he turned to his retinue of Persians and Fujita, the smallest at the end. And like when he was up by the lamppost, Abdul Baha beckoned to all of them and said, "Follow me." He turned around, he walked out into the middle of State Street between 2 of the bands, turned to the right, And here was this long line, the beloved master looking so distinguished, and all of them coming down to Fujita at the end. And as the band played, the master became part of the parade. And he marched all the way down State Street till he came to the other hotel, and he said to them to follow him. He marched out of State Street and in just in time for his very famous meeting at the other hotel.
From reading the books about your life, All Flags Flying and God Loves Laughter and so on, we hear so much about Africa. And there are so many beautiful stories about Africa and your time in Africa as pioneers and teachers and traveling teachers and so on. And I know that you attended the first Baha'i school south of the Sahara.
We were it. We didn't attend it.
Yes.
Bill and Michael and me, we were the three. The Uganda Teaching Committee had set up the program, and we lived for 3 weeks. This was our first introduction to Africa, practically. And we were living in a mud hut with a beautiful thatched roof. And we had classes every day from 8 o'clock in the morning until mid-afternoon, and then there was a break, and then they started again early evening. And those people that came in the evening, there were 9 special people. They were pioneers, going to be pioneers. And so we had special classes for them. And the rest of the people could come, but they couldn't talk at that time. It was just for those 9. But one of the translators was a very wonderful man. His name was Oule. And Oule used to disappear every afternoon. And we didn't know what happened to him. Not that it made any difference, because we had several translators and we didn't especially need him. But we wondered where he would go. And we learned that his wife was ill and that he would go off to see her and visit her in the afternoon. But they said he has had nothing but trouble since he has been a Baha'i. One time he and his wife and family went on a teaching trip, and all of the clothes in their house were covered with acid by their neighbors because they were persecuting them, because they had become Baha'is. And then another time they went on a teaching trip, and they have granaries made of kind of barrel-shaped things with a little thatched roof on, where they keep their winter grain. And when they came back from this teaching trip, all their winter grain had been put on the ground and ruined, so that substantially their winter food was ruined. They didn't have any for supplies. And so this, after we had found this out, we spoke to Ole, because we were concerned. He hadn't been a Baha'i very long, and we said, his faith could be shaken quite easily with so many difficult things happening to him. And we said something to him about, we hear a lot of unhappiness and unpleasant things have been happening to you since you have been a Baha'i. And he said, well, it hasn't really been that bad. But he said, the important thing, it was God polishing me inside.
Yeah. One of the things about Africa, which the beloved guardian admired, and which we ourselves were always very, very pleased about Africa. And there's no sweeter story, I think, than the first year when we were forming 15 local spiritual assemblies. We heard from the beloved guardian that we were going to have a national spiritual assembly. And it was just a little over a year away, and this year we had to form 15 local spiritual assemblies. Marguerite was off in Basutoland, and they were caught by a flash flood and had to wait several days. And Dwight Allen, who some of you will remember, and his brother, what's the middle brother's name? No matter. He got up to get there. We wanted to see if there was an assembly in this place way up in the Maluki Mountains. And he swam across a stream, took his clothes off, and held the declaration card. They had 8 members, and he wanted to get the 9th. And he swam over, he got it, and he swam back. And we got that assembly. But he, Ford, and myself remained in Johannesburg. And we went, it took us all day long to go out and collect all of the African believers. And finally, we brought them back to where we lived in the farm and where we had many meetings. And one of them, the first believer, was named Andres Karumbe. Such a sweet soul. And this tells you what they're like, really. And that was their first election. And I was standing behind Andres watching him, and I noticed he'd written down. There were 9 names, right? First name was Andres Karumbe. Oh, that's all right. You can vote for yourself. The second name was Andres Karumbe. The third, the fourth, and the fifth, all Andres Karumbe. I went to Bahia and I said, we may have a problem. And I told her what it was. Well, she said, go in there and keep your eye on it. And I stood behind there until he got down to the 9th one, Andres Karumbe. 9 of them on there. So I asked him to step out on the porch for a moment, and I said, Andres, you know about the voting for the local assembly. Oh, yes, he said, I studied it. Had it all read to me and everything. And I said, but you have 9 Andres Karumbes on there. Well, he said, you have to have 9 names, no more, no less. Yes, I said, but all Andres Karumbe. Oh, he said, well, what you have to know is that none of these 9 Andres Karumbes is this Andres Karumbe. He's not worthy to be on there at all. But I said, why 9 Andres Karumbe? Well, he said, I'm a very ignorant man and illiterate, and that's the only name I know. That's all I can write, but watch, and he told me, he says, you see this Andres Karumbe? That's Mr. Mabuli over there. And this Andres Karumbe is Mrs. Departy. He said, all of these Andres Karumbes are wonderful people and will serve the cause of God. But he said, this Andres Karumbe is not on there and probably never will be on there. But that's all I can write. The best that it is. And it was wonderful. And it worked all the way. And they all served, and they all were wonderful people. But he, one of the most of all. And that was the sweetness and the purity and the selfness we found in so many Baha'is, and why Mrs. Sears and I always long to go back. But the Universal House of Justice keeps saying, stay 1 more year. See if you can help with the vast increase in the number of newly ladies. Isn't that sweet, sir?
Mr. Sears, wasn't that Andres that you talked about that he had some trouble one time? He was mocked or something?
Yes, right. You tell that story. That's wonderful. In the townships where they live.
Every Friday night, usually the people are paid once a week on Friday, and when they come back to their townships, the Totsis, which are the crooks, come after them and beat them up, take their money away from them, and frequently kill them. And this happened to Andres as he was coming home one Friday. We saw him the following week, and he was telling us the story. And he said, oh, they were very, very bad. And they held a knife right at his throat. And they took all of his clothes except his underpants. He had nothing left, none of his money, none of his clothes, nothing was left to him. And he had to go home like that. And he said, I kept saying, Baha'u'llah, 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 Baha'u'llah. And they have an idea that if a person is insane, it is very, very bad for them to kill them. So that has saved his life because they thought he was just babbling. And so one of the other African friends was sitting there while he was telling the story, and they said, why didn't you say Ya Baha'u'llah? That's a call for help. And if you had said that, maybe they wouldn't have hurt you so much. He said, well, I don't know, but probably if if I had known that, which I didn't know, but if I had known that, maybe I could have saved my shoes. That would have been fair.
One of the reminiscences, this is about the Holy Land, and we weren't going, this is not about the beloved garden, though. But one of the sweetest stories that we have in all of our writings is about the Holy Land. It's about Baha'u'llah and Abdul-Baha. There is one garden. You've been on pilgrimage, you remember the little house where Baha'u'llah used to stay, over there and over here with the fountains splashing and gurgling. And Abdul-Baha and Baha'u'llah loved the children very deeply, and were so kind to them always. A lesson for us, if they can spend the time with the children, certainly we could too. Baha'u'llah used to send to Beirut and have beautiful goods and materials brought to the Rizwan garden, to the house. And then he would call the granddaughters and the children in and have them look over the material and decide which one they liked best. And then they would cut it into a pattern, and Baha'u'llah would see that the ladies of the house sewed it into beautiful garments. And when they came with these materials, it was really excited. And very often they would bring sweets. When Baha'u'llah saw the sweets, he would tell them, hide those sweets over there, out of the way, so Abdul-Baha can't find them. He said, if the master finds them, he'll give them all the way to the poor, and we won't have any sweets. And so they would hide them away. And then one day he would say to them, tomorrow, put on your prettiest frock, because we're all going together to a picnic in the Rizwan garden. Imagine those children going to a picnic with the King of Kings and the Lord of Hosts in the Rizwan garden. More than that, each week, Baha'u'llah and sometimes Abdul-Baha would have classes with them. And he would teach them about Moses, Baha'u'llah, and about Christ and Krishna, and all the messengers of God and what they did in the world. Now think about that for a moment. Here are these children being taught progressive revelation by Baha'u'llah, the promise of all ages, the one whom all the messengers of God had foretold, and they're hearing about that. And one time, Abdul-Baha, who was always, when he was little, going to parties, he went to the shepherds. They invited him to come to their big party. There's a name they have for this festival at the time, not the shearing, but some other time. And then when it was over, the master had a wonderful time, and the chief shepherd who had brought him there, he says, now you'll have to give a gift to the shepherds. And Abdul-Baha says, I don't have any gift to give. What? He said, you have to do that. It's customary. So Abdul-Baha wasn't to be lost on this whole thing, so he gave the shepherds Baha'u'llah sheep. And when Baha'u'llah was told about that, he said, well, that's like the master. And if we're not careful, someday he will give himself away. And of course, that's what he did, didn't he? All the days of his life. But think of that. Picnic in the gardens, progressive revelation with the master, and with Baha'u'llah, King of Kings and the Lord of Hosts, and the oneness of all the prophets of God. And if they remembered the children in that way, certainly that's something we should do. And Abdul-Baha writes in selections from the writings of Abdul-Baha and says, the greatest gift that any human being can give to God, the greatest service he can render to Almighty God, is to educate the children. And I think that's where we should really, that's what we should study and remember.
Before
we go back to that, can I go back once again? This same Ole, who was our translator,
Mr. Sears, he became, he was appointed the counselor, member of the Continental Board of Counselors later on.
Yes, he was until his very last term. He was a very wonderful counselor. But the Uganda Teaching Committee, he was on that that early teaching committee. And they were having a meeting, but it was about 20 miles away from his home. And they waited until it was time for the meeting to start, and he wasn't there, and they just decided he wasn't going to come that day, and so they began the meeting. And in a few minutes, he came huffing and puffing in on a bicycle. And he said, "I missed the bus, and I'm very sorry to be late, but now I'm here." And in Western fashion, I suppose, they said, "Well, you know, you wouldn't have had to come today. You could have stayed home and not made such an effort, because he had to borrow a bicycle and ride all of that distance." And he said no, because you will be discussing my area, and you don't know it that well, and I'm sure that I would be able to make suggestions that would be of help to you in your consultation about the people who are in my neighborhood. But besides that, he said, this is not the important thing. The important thing is that I could stay home and love Baha'u'llah, but I could not stay home and serve Baha'u'llah.
I'd like to go back to the household of the Holy Family.
Right, yes.
You told a wonderful story about a parrot.
Yes. As a matter of fact, Marguerite's got a picture of Abdul Baha's parrot.
Just a feather.
Well, that's a feather, yes. But that's a real feather. That feather belonged to the parrot that belonged to Abdul Baha.
You tell the story,
Right.
because you know the story better.
Well, I was at the school at Kings Mountain on the border of North and South Carolina a number of years ago. And this lady who served in the Holy Land, whose name at the moment I can't remember, I should, but I don't. But she told a story about this parrot there. She came with her daughter. She was very old, 90, and it was very beautiful, and I congratulated her on the story and everything. She said, "Would you like a feather from that parrot of Abdul Baha's?" I would. And I told her I would, and she said, "I'll send it to you." We both forgot about it, I thought. It was about 10 years later. And I was in Charlotte, North Carolina. And we were having a joint meeting with San Francisco on the telephone back and forth, singing to each other during that period when we were raising the funds for the faith on a special project. And then when the meeting was over in North Carolina, her daughter came up and handed me this feather. And she said, "My mother always wanted to bring it to you, and I never had time." Now, Abdul Baha was given this parrot. And he it was pretty hard for him to take care of the parrot, so he gave it to everybody in the kitchen, right? And they fell in love with the parrot. They taught it to speak Persian and Arabic, and they really did. Finally, there was a very famous man, not a Baha'i, from one of the cities in Israel, and he was coming to visit the master, and he happened to be very fond of birds, particularly parrots. So Abdul Baha came into the kitchen and told his friends the man was coming, and about his fondness for parrots, and he asked if he could have the parrot back. He didn't know about all this language lessons. And he wanted to give it to this man, and of course they said nothing. It was, after all, Abdul Baha's parrot. So they gave it to him. And Abdul Baha took it in. The man was coming in 2-3 hours. He set it on the table where he was working the cage. And then he was away about halfway across the room writing. And the parrot began to speak the things he'd been taught. He said, "Bego! Bego! Say!" Right? And Abdul Baha laughed and looked at him and he said, "Say what?" Bego cheek, right? Say what? And the parrot said, "Bego, yeah!" Abdul-Baha began to chuckle, and he kept on going. He says, Bego ya Baha? The parrot. And Abdul-Baha loved it. And finally the parrot shouted out real loud, Bego ya Baha Alabha. That was too much for Abdul-Baha. He picked up the parrot and took it back out to the kitchen. He said, this parrot is far too eloquent. You keep it here and love it and teach it more. And of course, the tears were coming down their cheeks. They were so thrilled to get the parrot back. And then Abdul-Baha said that the parrot saved its life with its own tongue.
I know that each one of you met the Guardian and served during the Guardian's ministry and so on, and you were going to save your memories of the Guardian for the tape later on, but you had some beautiful stories of showing you Fendi was as a little boy.
Oh, yes. I had the great privilege of being with Mr. Varga, the hand of the cause, not the present one, his father. And
what did the Guardian say about it when you were on pilgrimage?
When I was on pilgrimage, the beloved Guardian said that this Mr. Varga was the most distinguished of the hands, which was, and he was a delightful man, I'm sure any of you who knew him knew this. And I had the privilege of meeting him in Kampala at the first intercontinental conference that was ever held in the world, and also in Chicago. And in Chicago, I recorded some of the stories because he would also go and speak with the children when he went to wherever there were children. And he would tell them stories. And those records I gave to the National Spiritual Assembly before we left for Africa that same year. And I don't know what has become of them since. But one of the stories that he told was of Shogi Effendi when he was, I think, about 7 years old. I'm sure there must be somebody around here who's 7 years old. No, he was about so high, something like that. And what he would do, when Abdul-Baha would have so much work to do during the daytime that he didn't have an opportunity of visiting the friends that he normally visited who were ill or who were poor or who were in need of consolation in one way or another, he would go in the evening. And of course, those days in Haifa, the roads were not very smooth. They were full of ruts and everything. And so Abdul-Baha was getting old. So Shogi Effendi had a little lantern. And he would carry the lantern by Abdul-Baha's feet, so Abdul-Baha would not stumble. It's such a beautiful picture of these two walking down the road. And then as they would come to a house where Abdul-Baha was going to visit people, he would sit on the porch outside, and he would put his feet up and turn the lantern down, because even those days he was very economical. And he would go to sleep until Abdul-Baha came out from the house and went on to the next place where he would do the same thing again. But isn't that a lovely picture of the guardian, the future guardian, guiding the footsteps of Abdul-Baha, and Abdul-Baha teaching him and training him at the same time?
And he taught him to chant. Tell him about that.
Yes,
He was very small.
When he was very small, Abdul-Baha told him he wanted to hear him chant, so that no matter where in the house he was, he would hear him chant. And then Abdul-Baha...
he would say from way down in the garden.
And then Abdul-Baha went, I think it was to Beirut, and the family had to write to him and said, please, write to Shogi Effendi and tell him not to chant so loud you can hear him in Beirut.
That's what he was trying to do.
The whole family can't stand it.
I was thinking about something you said earlier that reminded me of. In the early days, long ago, it's a reminiscence about Alaska. And they were having trying to have the first big campaign of teaching. And the city, I think it was Anchorage, wasn't it?
I think so.
Anyway, they were having, without the Baha'is, so they were not interested in helping. It was a long time ago. The faith was just getting started. And the Metropolitan Opera was having a big meeting in Anchorage, and the Baha'is wanted to be a part of it, but they wouldn't invite them to be a part of it. And Jan Pierce, a very famous singer you probably all know, was coming. And the whole city was excited about it. And the Baha'is. And for a long time before that particular meeting, they'd been trying to decide whom they should write to and invite to come and help them with their own campaign. The name of Billy DeForge came up repeatedly. They all said, no, he's a wonderful man, he's a great speaker, but he's not for Alaska. Not here at this particular time in Alaska. So they didn't invite him. But everybody they invited couldn't come. They'd been going on for several months. And finally, toward the end, it looked like if they wanted anybody, it was going to have to be Billy DeForge. What a pity, they thought. Anyway, they were there at the meeting, and with this great and beautiful hall, and up here on the front of the stage was where Jan Pierce would be, and all the well-known people of Anchorage or Juneau or whatever the city was up there. And the Baha'is couldn't even get into these seats. They had a standing room only at the back. And they were there. This is to show you what Baha'u'llah does when you arise. Changes the atmosphere for your victory. And finally, the night of the concert came, and they were having this big banquet before the concert. Everything looked beautiful, flowers everywhere. And way in the back, the other people, not the Baha'is either, were standing where some of the Baha'is. And Billy DeForge was there, and he was with them. And then the time came, and they're waiting now for the guest of honor. You know, the Rolls Royce is drawing up out in front, and through this main aisle is coming Jan Pierce to come up to the front. And when he came through the door in the back, he looked around, and he looked over there, and he saw Billy DeForge, whom he knew personally and loved, and he said, Billy DeForge, what are you doing here in Anchorage? He said, are there Baha'is in Anchorage? And Billy said, there are Baha'is everywhere, Jan. And he gave him a great big hug, and Billy DeForge said, please give my love to your mother. Where is she now? She's in Peru, Jan Pierce said. And Billy said, Peru? Why, we have a National Spiritual Assembly in Peru. You mean there's Baha'is in Peru? They're everywhere, man. I'll give you the address so your mother can invite them. Please do. She'd love to have them. And he called up to the front. He said, please, fix a place beside my chair for my friend Billy DeForge. I want him on the front platform and with me. He's a great and well-known Baha'i all over the world. And while they were fixing the place, he turned around, hugged Billy again, and he said, tell the Baha'is everywhere to spread the word, spread the word, spread the word. He said, I can see they're doing that. That's the word of Baha'u'llah.
Tell the story about Lua.
Is that in the flame?
Probably.
I don't know if you all know the story, but it is such a beautiful and touching story. Lua Getzinger, as you know, was one of the great teachers of the West, and very, very deeply in love with Abdu'l-Baha and with the teachings and with doing whatever she could to serve the cause of God. And one night she had a dream, and she dreamt that she saw Abdu'l-Baha walking up a roadway that was going up a hill. And behind him came all of these people, and they were crippled, they were blind, they were deaf, they were just sort of the dregs of the earth. And they followed Abdu'l-Baha in whatever way they could. And Lua went up to Abdu'l-Baha and she said, dear Abdu'l-Baha, what are you doing with all of these people? And Abdu'l-Baha looked at her and he said, Lua, they are the best that I can get.
Yeah. And that's what we all are in one way or another, you know, to the old world. Deaf to what happened to the old world, blind. But we will change the world, there is no question about it, from all that is happening. It says in our writings that one soul can set an entire country ablaze. One soul can open up a new territory, can bring in large numbers of people. One soul. That means any one of us, too. So it's wonderful and exciting. I hope to talk a little more about that on Sunday. Yes. This is an orange blossom. I was at the World Convention, and this is from Bangladesh, an orange blossom from the tree in Bangladesh, given to me. They said, Mr. Sears, we read in Cry from the Heart how you said there were orange trees growing all over the world from seeds of the orange tree in the Bob's Garden. And that if the Baha'is wanted to, and the day opened up for the persecutions to stop, they could plant an orchard of orange trees around the whole city of Shiraz. They said, keep this in your wallet, this picture, and let them know that's from Bangladesh. And they told me, if I saw you at the World Convention, to have that there. It was a wonderful convention. Persians couldn't come because of persecution. But here was the stage where the tellers and everything, and down on that side, huge bouquet of red roses from Iran. And every National Assembly that came down the steps was given one of these fresh red roses in the name of the Persians who couldn't come. And over on this side, they had two things. One said, now voting Iraq, and then on the side right near it, they put up the sign, what was next to come. And we were sitting down there watching. And then the sign came up in alphabetical order, next to both Iran, Persia. Such a silence came over that hall that you can't believe. And then like one man, the whole auditorium of delegates of the NSAs in their native costume from the world over rose up like a tidal wave. And the cheering didn't stop. You could have heard it way in downtown Haifa, honoring Iran, who couldn't be there to vote. If you had spent $1 million to produce that particular scene and hired the people to come up, it would never have come close to what happened on that day when the sign went up next to both Iraq. Because, of course, wherever we are, they are always very dear to our hearts. I think that I'm going to tell just one more story and we're going to stop with our hour. I know we've been given permission, and Red Brammer's agreed he doesn't mind if we take another half hour, but I believe you've had a long, full day. And I would only like to tell you one story. What was it what your mom said about Dr. Baghdad when she heard the Guardian heard the news?
Yes, she said the last time that she saw the Guardian shed tears was when the word came that Dr. Baghdadi had passed away.
We tried to visit his resting place in Augusta, Georgia when we were here. But when I was writing on one of my books, and I was going through the archives and other things looking for material, I found this letter from Dr. Zia Baghdadi, whom the Guardian loves so much, and the Master. Rabbi Khanum had told us many beautiful stories about him. This was just a simple story about prayer. He was in the mansion, visiting there, imagine, on a pilgrimage, and Abdul Baha was in the mansion at the same time, and Baha'u'llah was in the mansion at the same time. And Dr. Baghdadi, writing about it, said that he got up at midnight, as Abdul Baha had said he often had loved to say prayers in the middle of the night. And Dr. Baghdadi had gone out into the hall of the mansion. And he had his hands folded together and he bowed his head and he was going quietly whisper to himself one of his favorite prayers. And just as he was about to pray, he heard the voice of the Master lifted in prayer. He was on this room, on this side, he was standing in the middle. Imagine such a thing. His heart was so touched, he said, that he could do nothing but stand there and watch the tears come down his cheeks, because the Master had told him just a short time before that if it weren't for the prayers, his heart and soul would have melted because of all the suffering and troubles that were coming from all parts of the world. But that the prayers were his source of life and sustenance. So he listened until the end and stood there silent for quite a long period of time. He was about to raise his voice in prayer again when he heard the voice of Baha'u'llah, the Blessed Beauty, raised in prayer. Imagine standing there between the rooms of Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'llah, King of Kings, Lord of Hosts, glory of God. And he listened again through and thought, what a blessing it was for him to be there. Quietly to himself, when Baha'u'llah finished, Dr. Baghdadi finished his own prayer silently to himself and went back to his room and said in the lower part of his letter, I can't remember it now, that all the days of his life he would never forget the moment when he was blessed to hear the Blessed Master chant his prayers and the Blessed Beauty, Baha'u'llah. What a wonderful thing. How all of us would be envious to have that happen. Beloved friends, that's the craziest looking dog that's on earth. Yes, I will, yes. I want to say about Stephen. I was a hand in the cause of God, still am, but at the time when the hands and the auxiliary report members were linked together, you will remember well. They were our assistants, our helpers, and their chief deputies. Wherever I was in the world at conferences, whatever I was doing or at NSA meetings, wherever this auxiliary board member was present, he always went out of his way to help me, to see that whatever it was I needed, that I received. And I remember him with tender love as the best helper, assistant, and deputy that I ever had in my life as a head.
Has always been Mrs. Sears. And before you leave, there's a sweet story that you told me one time about when you were registering at a Baha'i conference in Mauritius. Please tell that.
The very last one. The representative of the Universal House of Justice to the Mauritius Conference. Well, we went about a week early because there were radio programs and television programs that were being done, all kinds of things. And Mr. Quigley was with us when we were there. As a matter of fact, we went directly from Persia to South Africa to Mauritius. And we were traveling tourist class, and Mr. Quigley was traveling first class. In fact, the only person in first class. So we were sitting in the seats just at the end so we could talk between first class and tourist class. And we had clothing for three seasons with us because we had been traveling for months and months and months. Cold weather, warm weather, etc. And I had done a few things in Persia, including baskets and a few other things.
She would bargain with the man at the counter, the Persian one, and I'd say, that's all right, the price is right, pay it. So you keep out of this. She had the first spirit.
Anyway, since we down to register for the conference because they had the registry open the entire few days before the conference. So there were many, many, many people coming from all over the world. And the girl who was at the desk registering people, I didn't know and she didn't know me. And she had this row of ribbons. There was one color for a hand of the cause, and one color for National Spiritual Assembly members, and one color for counselors, and one color for auxiliary board members. And then down here was a color that was for anybody. So, anybody else, that is. And I put my name down and I registered and I handed in my slip and she said, what are you? And I said, I'm nothing. And she said, well, she said, you must be something. No, actually, I'm nothing. She said, well, I know you're not a hand and I don't think you're a counselor, but are you an NSA member? And I said, no. And she said, are you an auxiliary board member? I said, no. And she said, well, what are you? And I said, well, I'm a wife of the hand of the cause. She said, but that's nothing. I'm trying to tell you. She gave me a good ribbon, and
Friends, this has been a memorable program tonight. But before we end, I want to ask Mr. Sears if he'll tell just one more story. I heard you tell us about this recently.
Well, you gotta hear what it is. I think the answer is no.
Well, this role of interviewer is what prompted my mind about this, because there was a time, I think, that you told about interviewing Hand of the Cause of God. Is this story true?
Yes, that's true. I did. And that's what, will this be the last one if I do that?
I promise.
I told it recently when I was doing the memorial to her daughter, Edna True, wonderful and great servant of the cause of God. Mrs. True was a wonderful lady, a hand of the cause of God. Her fingers were all swollen from writing receipts from contributions to the temple that came in from all over the world. And Edna said to me one day, she said to Bill, I want to get a recollection of my mother's visit to the Holy Land on pilgrimage to meet the Master. And I want to put it on tape, but she's deathly afraid of microphones. Would you mind doing that program and working it out? I said I'd be most happy to do that. So we got the microphone all set, and we got the biggest bouquet of flowers you ever saw in your whole life. Really. Nowadays, none of us could afford it, but in those days it wasn't so bad, but it was beautiful. And very skillfully, we hid the microphone in the bouquet of flowers. And we thought that her mother would pay no attention to it. So we started the interview. It was going along very well. It was in two parts. We broke for lunch. We did the second half in the afternoon. And when I came back in the afternoon, Mrs. True was sitting here, Edna was sitting there, and Mrs. True looked at me, Corinne True, and she said, Bill, I said, yes. She said, you know, you don't have to hide that microphone from me. She said, it doesn't make me nervous unless it makes you nervous. And so we took it up, and we did the interview with her, and it was very beautiful. As she told the story about going on pilgrimage, all of the friends had presents to take with her. Take to the Master, names for the children, just endless suitcases and things. But one thing that they wanted her to take along, and she didn't want to take, was a list of names, a scroll, of the people in Wilmette and Chicago who wanted to build a temple on that spot there in Wilmette. And she said, I can't do that. She said, I can't possibly take a thing like that and give it to Abdu'l-Baha. She says, who am I to do that? She refused. Well, her own assembly outvoted her. And everybody else at the meeting where they were doing this outvoted her. She was the only one against it. And so finally she succumbed to the pressure and said, I'm only doing it for love. I don't know how I'll do it. I'll try to find a way, but I'm sure it's the wrong thing and the master won't be interested in that, especially from me. She took it along with everything else. And the first night when after dinner she was going to meet the master, in the room she had all of these things out there, all of the gifts from all of the people, you know, really all over the place, and she was holding in her hand that blasted scroll. She didn't know what to do with it, and then she heard the sound of footsteps. And she knew that was the master coming. And she was becoming terrified. And just as the door was opening, she hid it behind her back, where maybe he wouldn't find it and she'd think of something to do with it later. The master came in and greeted her and kept moving forward, never stopped. Went up to her, reached behind her back, took the scroll, held it aloft, and said, Mashrakalaz Kar. That is the important thing. And then he went on during her stay there to talk about the house of worship and what it meant. And of course, as we know, it became the mother temple. I have stood under the dome and told that story, thinking of all the people I could see. And it has given birth to other Mashrakalaz Kar all over the world. But the master knew, and she was the instrument of winning those victories in so many places.
On behalf of all of us here at Green Lake, I want to say thank you. This has been the most delightful, sweetest evening I can remember. Thank you.
Feel the same way.